Like one of the criticisms of the book is it has a lot of anecdotes. And anecdotes are very, very interesting, and I find them very interesting as well. And for an example, they have the anecdote of the envelope. Now, the anecdote about the envelope is they go to lunch with someone from AIPAC. And they're trying to show, the point is AIPAC is very influential when it comes to the Hill. So how do you know that? The anecdote is the following. They go out to lunch with this guy, and he's trying to, one of them is interviewing this person from AIPAC. How powerful are you? How influential are you? You know, what's the true story? He said, you see this envelope? If you give me, I don't know, like 2 hours or 3 hours, I'll get 68 signatures in the Senate. Okay, so, you know, one of the points is, you know, the Arab oil, the oil lobby, they don't go around showing off about what they can do with envelopes as well. No, but my point is, and I will leave them till the end in questions, is that basically with this, what I'm going to be talking about today, it's not based on anecdotal research. It's not an anecdote, it's a case study of the exercise of Jewish and Israeli influence in American politics. Okay? Based on archival research, which I won't go into, but I had access to archives of several major American Jewish organizations, in particular the Joint Distribution Committee, the Council of Jewish Federations, which was really the big power, as we'll see, during that period, and HIAS, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, although they stonewalled, and then there were a lot of very important documents in the New York Public Library. Next point I want to move on to after the introduction is just Israeli influence on American Jewry. Just a couple of points in terms of background. The key date is probably the change that takes place during the 1967 war. A lot of people have written about the effect of the 67 war on the American Jewish community. It basically, some people argue, changes sort of American Jewish identity, creating, the first point here about adding to the backbone of the American Jewish community a sense of pride, leading to much greater activism, open public activism on behalf of Jewish interests in the United States. Silberman's book in 1985, the 1967 victory marked the moment when American Jews gained pride in being Jewish. Okay, now the other thing that happened was, besides gaining pride, becoming more activists, the Israeli government in particular, had much greater interest on the American Jewish community. Probably the height of influence is 67 and after. And since then it's been in decline. And we'll see to some extent the extent of the decline by the time you get up to the 1970s, which is not too long after 1967. But in 1967, a couple of people have written about this, suggesting, you know, when the Israelis said jump, American Jewish leadership were willing to jump. But again, we'll see in certain issues the role they played. Now, what I want to deal with in this talk, my point that I would make about the Israeli influence, I'm having a little trouble dealing with the slides and with my own comments. About the Israeli influence, one should understand that after 67, the Israeli government had a great deal of influence vis-a-vis what we call establishment Jewish organizations. There's a lot of cooperation, there was a lot of identification in the American Jewish community with Israel, with the recent war, and they had a very good working relationship with a lot of cooperation. Now, the talk I'm going to deal with today has three parts. One is the Israeli role in setting up something called the Soviet Jewry movement in the United States. Second issue is going to be something called dropouts. These are Jews leaving the Soviet Union on the way to Israel, coming to Vienna, and then deciding, we don't want to go to Israel, we want to go some other place. In Hebrew, they use the term called noshrim. In English, it's called dropouts. And the third part of the talk will deal with Gorbachev, the Gorbachev years, comes to power 85, 86, and basically opens up the gates of the Soviet Union. As I said before, these are the archives that I used, and also extensive interviews of many of the actors involved, which I'll be talking about. Okay, now, the initiation of the Soviet Jewry movement in the United States. I've been doing more research on the subject, so some of my earlier conclusions are a little problematic. But the idea is that before the 1960s, there wasn't an issue, a public issue within the Jewish community or within American society in general, that there's a specific problem with Soviet Jewry. That they're disappearing, that their culture is being snuffed out, that certain leaders had been killed over the years, etc. I mean, there wasn't a high awareness of it. There was an organization called the Jewish Labor Committee, Yiddish-speaking unionists who used to meet once a year in New York. They'd go to a cemetery and they'd have a commemoration ceremony with anywhere between 50, at times several hundred people, talking about Jewish poets and writers and leaders that had been killed by Stalin over the years. That was about the extent of it. Now, there are some exceptions to this, but I'm just going to leave that for now. The point is that I argue, and I try to show this in the book, is that the Israelis basically initiated the Soviet Jewry movement. What does that mean that they initiated it? They, through their representatives, and I'll get specific in a few moments, approached major American Jewish organizations and tried to sell them on the idea there's a serious problem affecting Jews in the Soviet Union. That denied religious rights, that denied freedom, cultural rights, and what probably is going to happen in a short period of time, they're all going to disappear. So the theme was this idea of what they call cultural genocide, unless some action is taken. And the action that they wanted taken was basically for the United States government to pressure the government in the Soviet Union to either let the Jews have their rights under the 1936 Stalin Constitution or let them leave. Okay? The organization in Israel was something called the Liaison Bureau. Some of you might recall something called Aliyah Bet, illegal immigration, sort of spy types that went to Europe 44 and after, especially after the war. They went into the Eastern Zone. They tried to get Jews, smuggle Jews out from the Eastern Zone into the Western Zone, meaning the United States and Germany, and then from there they'd be brought into Israel. Before 1948, it was all done illegally. And then after the war, they just brought in the rest. After independence, they brought in the refugees. Now, this group, more or less, the Aliyah Bet people went out of business once you had a legal state of Israel, because anyone could come into the country free. You didn't need a special organization. So some of the leaders of that group approached Ben-Gurion, and the idea was Israel was very much concerned about demography, even back then. There weren't enough Jews in the country, and I would even argue, some people might not accept the idea, that there was a concern for the growing number of non-Ashkenazi Jews in the country. So the point was, where are we going to get Ashkenazi Jews for the state of Israel? Jews, from Europe, etc. So there were two major communities. One was the United States of America with over 5 million Jews. The other was the Soviet Union with about 3 million Jews. The number isn't certain. They were of the opinion American Jews will never come to Israel. The only hope for Israel over the long run, but this could be a couple of generations down the road, are Jews in the Soviet Union. Despite the fact that many of the Jews in the Soviet Union aren't necessarily Ashkenazi, but that point wasn't emphasized at the time. So what they did was they set up an organization called the Liaison Bureau. It's not as simple as it sounds. They were put in the office of the Prime Minister, responsible to the Prime Minister, but they operated out of the Foreign Office. The first thing they did was, the idea was, our objective is to get the Jews of the Soviet Union, 3 million about, and get them to come to the state of Israel. Now, keep in mind, in 1952, when they first got organized, Stalin is still the head of the Soviet Union. There's an iron curtain. Some people, including Ben-Gurion, might have thought that it was pie in the sky. Is it really a realistic type of thing? But they talked about a long-term project. So what they did was they sent representatives to the Soviet Union. What does that mean? They took 4 people with diplomatic passports, went to work in the Israeli embassy in Moscow. One was an agricultural attaché. I don't know what the other 3 were. All 4 were married. 8 people spoke Russian. All were native. They all spoke Russian from the time of their birth. Once they got to the Soviet Union, the whole idea was just establish contacts with Jews. They had a lot of names from the past. They traveled all over the Soviet Union, let people know there's Israel, we care, we're interested, and then just send back reports all the time, and we'll put together all this information. Okay, but I'm going to leave that. The other thing was, they realized BA, which is an acronym, they realized Israel has no influence whatsoever vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. There's no way that Israel is ever going to be able to influence the Soviet Union to change its policy towards its Jewish citizens or to let them go. So the idea was we have to get to the West, Europe and to the United States, to try to influence those governments, especially the United States of America, which in turn can influence the Soviet Union. So the major objective became focusing on the United States. So what did they do in Washington, for example? From the late 50s on, someone was assigned to the embassy in Washington, someone who was an expert on the Soviet Union, would go up to Capitol Hill all the time. Remember, it was the Cold War, testify in various congressional hearings about Soviet Union, persecution of Jews, anti-Semitism, and everything else. This group probably smuggled out, by the way, Khrushchev's speech at the 10th Party Congress where he attacked Stalin. That probably made it to Western media via contacts of the Liaison Bureau in the Soviet Union. So you had, wait a minute, can you go back to the, no, I didn't finish with the slide. So they had someone in Washington, D.C. Now in D.C. he also made contact the person with reporters from Newsweek, Time Magazine, New York Times, Washington Post, to try to get information out about the status of Jews in the Soviet Union, hoping someone would publish something and someone would read it. The other thing was, in New York City, where Israel has a consulate, they had one consul in particular. There were 7 or 8 in New York. His purpose was, or her purpose was, to meet with Jewish organizations. They're all located in New York, the national organizations, and get them to take up the issue of Soviet Jewry. Okay. Now, and the idea was to put the issue on the public agenda of the American public, but also Jewish groups as well. And the idea was they pushed the idea of cultural genocide, lack of rights. Give them rights or let them leave, immigration to the homeland. Now, the point that I would emphasize about the message was, we're not anti-communist. In other words, the Israeli message was, we don't want to be seen as anti-communist. There is a constitution in the Soviet Union, written by Stalin in 1936. It promises cultural rights. Tens, if not hundreds, of different minority groups have cultural rights. One group doesn't, the Jews. That was the message. Now, one of the reasons why they did that was, in Western Europe, there were communist parties. And over the years, they convinced representatives of the Italian Communist Party, the French Communist Party. They would show up for party congresses in Moscow. What did they want to talk about? The denial of rights for Soviet Jews. And you know, the Soviet Union was there, what are you talking about? And they said, well, we have all this evidence, we have data, what's going on? And that was part of their strategy. Now, in the United States, there were other groups, grassroots groups, not associated with the Israelis. The Union of Councils, which I'll pick up in questions, they tended to be anti-communist, but the mainstream, or the Israeli message, was not one of anti-communism. Okay, now, just very, very quickly, they hired someone named Moshe Dekta. He just passed away. Dekta was probably the only American that worked for the Liaison Bureau. He edited a socialist magazine, which very few people read, sort of an intellectual type journal, but it was the first time ever in the English language he published a 2-volume issue all about the status of Jews in the Soviet Union. It's the first time that information had ever come out. Much of it came from the Israelis, but he also gathered it as well. What were some of his activities? They set him up, he had a front organization called the Conference on the Status of Soviet Jews. They were located on the grounds of the American Jewish Congress on West 84th Street, or East 84th Street in New York. Sorry to get mixed up. They had a carriage house out back. So in that carriage house, that's where Dekta had his office. He was working for the Israelis. No one knew about it, including most American Jewish organizations and everyone else associated with him. One of the projects he takes up during Khrushchev's time were the economic crimes. A lot of people were arrested for economic crimes under Khrushchev. Many of them happened to be Jewish. A couple of people were being killed. He writes a letter of protest to Khrushchev saying, you're being anti-Semitic. What happens? He doesn't sign the letter. He goes to Martin Luther King, William O. Douglas of the Supreme Court, Mrs. FDR, and Reinhold Niebuhr. All four sign. What happens to the letter? No one knows. I never checked the Soviet archives. However, the next day, it makes the front page of the New York Times, which means all of a sudden people from coast to coast, even in those days, the Times would be late in the afternoon, but to get to Chicago and then LA probably at night, everyone was reading, and there are also news services, reading about the fact that William O. Douglas of the Supreme Court of the United States signed a letter charging anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. So you get the issue out, people read about it, people know. Now, in this front organization, who signed up, or who were the people that were sponsoring it? Norman Thomas, it's an old name, from the socialist movement, Walter Reuther from the unions, William O. Douglas, Martin Luther King, and Arthur Miller. So I mean, you had very I'm sorry.
What was the name of his magazine?
I'll get it for you afterwards. I just don't have it on the tip of my tongue. I apologize. Now, give you an example of something else that happens. Eugene Gold is involved in a Jewish organization affiliated with the Soviet Jewry movement. What does he do? He's associated with the National District Attorneys Association in the United States. They put together a national tour of the Soviet Union. They're going to send 20, 30, 40 DAs from all over the United States. He was a district attorney in either Brooklyn or Queens. They're going to go to the Soviet Union. They're going to invite 30 or 40 DAs, or the equivalent, from the Soviet Union to visit American cities. The Soviet delegation comes, they go around all over the United States on a fantastic tour. Every time there's a public meeting, they sit around in a room like this with other district attorneys. What's the first question that comes up? What about the Jews? With documentation and the number of why aren't there Jewish schools, why aren't there Jewish magazines, publications, theater, and everything else. When they go to the Soviet Union and they have all these public meetings, they bring up a couple people in the delegation all the time. What about the Jews? What about the Jews? I mean, that's the way some of these things were done. One very colorful thing was they approached Telford Taylor, who was the chief prosecutor at Nuremberg from World War II. He in turn contacted Roman Rudenko, who was his counterpart in the Soviet Union. What was the issue that Telford Taylor raised? Persecute Jews that were arrested for various crimes, they're being framed, what about their rights, and other things like that. Now, Taylor said, I'll do anything you want me to do. I'm very much interested in the issue, but no Israelis. He didn't want any connection with Israel. He smelled it. But basically what happened was the money was raised. They got Dershowitz to do a lot of the research, and it was raised by someone named Raga. Ijo Raga, who worked at the Israeli consulate, who was one of these liaison bureau agents. But that was that was the way they did things behind the scenes. Elie Wiesel's book, the liaison bureau sent him to the Soviet Union, helped him publish the book, and the book was called Jews of Silence, became a bestseller in the late 60s. All about Soviet Jews wanting to be Jewish, who's silent, the American Jewish community. If you look at his book, there's an afterword, Neil Kozador, who subsequently edited commentary. He translated the book from French into English. In the book, he thanks, who does he thank? Moshe Dekta. Why does he thank Moshe Dekta? Because Moshe Dekta gave him 20 pages of an afterword, which is at the end of the book. What's the afterword of 20 pages? All these facts of how Jews are discriminated on the basis of culture and religion and everything else in the Soviet Union. So everyone that picked up the novel had, at the end of the book, you had 20 pages of facts and figures about how Soviet Jews had disappeared. Okay, so that's the way they acted, that's the way they worked. I mean, to give you an example of just, well, one other thing, which from more recent research, and maybe I shouldn't spend so much time on it, oh no, but I forgot the name. I'll come back to that. I'll bring up an example at the end. I've got to state of my, Roger Baldwin. Roger Baldwin headed the ACLU in New York, known as a liberal non-Jewish. They approached him about the time they're sending letters to Khrushchev. And who approached him? Someone from the American Jewish Committee. It was all coordinated. The American Jewish Committee, they go to see him, and Baldwin says, what are you talking about? Anti-Semitism? Persecution? Everyone's persecuted in the Soviet Union. Why are the Jews so unique? I'm not signing anything. They wanted to put an ad in the New York Times, full-page ad. 3 months later, the full-page ad comes out. Roger Baldwin, in the name of the ACLU, carries a lot of weight. He signs it. They worked on him. In other words, this was all part of the effort. Now, political organization, they set up two. Just very, very quickly, I want to deal here with the National Conference of Soviet Jewry in '71. What the Israelis helped put together was a coalition of every single major American organization that committed itself to the struggle for Soviet Jewry. And that came about in 1971. They didn't have much funding, they didn't have much manpower, but basically you got every major Jewish organization involved. They'd come to Washington to lobby, and it was clear to everyone, if you have Hadassah, all three synagogue movements, B'nai B'rith, you have people in every city and town throughout the 50 states of the United States. And that's one thing that they achieved in terms of this broad umbrella organization, and they struggled to put the issue on the public agenda. Now, for the major issue, one of the fights that took place that eventually happened was Jackson-Vanik in '72-'73 over the issue of providing most favored nation status to the Soviet Union. You might recall Senator Jackson opposed the amendment on the basis of let the Soviets commit to letting the Jews leave. What's interesting is basically the President of the United States in around 1972-73, April 30th, 1973, comes to a joint meeting of the National Conference of Soviet Jewry and the President's Conference of Major American Jewish Organizations. And he said to them, look, I'm President of the United States. America needs the Soviet Union. We need trade. It's in America's interest. And again, I'm President. And he left the meeting, and then they had a debate for a couple of hours. And basically it was Balfour Brickner, the Reform rabbi, against Max Fisher. Fisher supported Nixon, and Brickner said, we have to support Soviet Jewry. And they basically decided, we oppose the President of the United States because we're fighting for the issue of Soviet Jewry. So that's the issue eventually gets on the agenda of the United States, as we'll see later on. But in the American public, everyone becomes aware of Soviet Jewry. There were marches all the time. Every year there's a march of over 150,000 in New York, but there were activities in hundreds of cities around the country, in almost every single state, year-round, during the late 70s, 1980s. Dropouts. Kosygin goes to Paris in 1966, number 2 in the Soviet Union, and he announces, my government supports family reunification. Now, what did that mean? That had to do with World War II, families being separated. His government was going to allow family reunification. Why? They wanted to score points in the West. So they do human rights things. Now, but the thing was that they published it in Russian. So in other words, it was in all the Soviet press the next day what Kosygin said. The next day, thousands, if not tens of thousands of Jews registered to go to Israel on the basis of family reunification. So that's all the way back in '66. Now, the Soviets later changed their position, family reunification to one's homeland. Why? You have hundreds of minorities in the Soviet Union, tens of minorities with large populations. There were only 2 or 3 of those minorities that have a homeland outside of the Soviet Union. The Germans, there were some Japanese and some Greeks, and then there were the Jews. So if you say, what about the Jews? So all of a sudden the homeland, my grandfather's homeland becomes Israel, because it served Soviet purposes in the sense, okay, we can let the Jews go, but not the Ukrainians. So probably many Ukrainian families who are all disunited, they want to leave too. They can't leave because their homeland is within the Soviet Union. So that's why the Soviet Union liked this idea. The Jews want to go to their homeland. Those that want to leave, that's very, very good. So more or less, they saw eye to eye with the Israelis about where Soviet Jews should go. Not everyone agreed with that. By '69, you get 200 or 300 people coming out every month. After 67, there were no direct ties between the Soviet Union and Israel, so they have to go by way of Vienna. Okay, so I don't want to get into the visa. You had to have letters, you had to have a letter of invitation. All these things were forged. The Soviets knew they were forged. The Liaison Bureau would they hire students from the Hebrew University that would be studying Russian studies. So what they would do is on the side, part of their scholarship would be write 50 letters, write 100 letters a week or something like that to your relatives in the Soviet Union. But the Soviets knew it was a game, everyone played the game. But the Israeli government had to stamp it. Because if someone's going to be let out, the government had to say, we're willing to accept it. There were letters also from the United States, but it was much more problematic. And eventually you went to the Dutch embassy and you got a visa after the Ministry of Interior approved it to go to Israel. Now, what happened? As the major way of getting out was you took a train to Austria, you crossed the Austrian border, and you were met there by an Israeli delegation, either liaison people or some people from an organization called the Jewish Agency, and they collected everyone's passports. And then they went to Vienna, and then they stayed overnight in a castle, and the next day they flew out to Israel. After 73, up until 73, no one drops out, everyone goes to Israel. After 73, they start dropping out, meaning we get to, what happened was there was a terrorist incident in 73, and the Austrians changed the arrangement. When everyone came across the border, the Austrians collected the passports, not the Israelis. And when they got to Vienna, the Austrians then said to people, okay, who wants to go to Israel? You want to go to Israel? Go over here. Here are your passports, go over here. You don't want to go to Israel? Go over to this side, here are your passports. So people started dropping out, meaning they wanted to go other places, primarily to the United States. Why? A lot of it had to do with the war in Israel, but they were different people. They came from the heartland, very assimilated Jews from the Ukraine, from Russia, and from Belarus. Plus there was also assistance, as we'll see, if you wanted to go to the United States. And the United States was the United States. Now, with the dropouts, what happens in the American Jewish community? The Council of Jewish Federations, that's the CJF, that's the umbrella organization of all these federations around the country, together with HIAS, they pressured the United States government for refugee status or parole for those Soviet Jews that wanted to go from Vienna to the United States. Okay, and basically they got preferential treatment. It's very hard until 1988. In other words, one of the things that's sort of ironic in light of World War II, it's very difficult to find cases of Soviet Jews who wanted to come to the United States from about 68 on. So, I want to be careful. Those who wanted to come to the United States, let's say from 1976 until 1988, virtually no one is rejected. So you either come in as a refugee, or else you come in under parole via the Attorney General has parole. You can bring people into the country for a period of time. So basically the Soviet Jews were getting preferential treatment, reflects probably American Jewish influence or Jewish influence in American politics. Now, the Liaison Bureau, originally they went to HIAS and JDC, and they said, get these people out of Vienna. Why did they want to get these people out of Vienna? Vienna was filling up with dropouts, and the Israelis were afraid that the Austrians would get angry by the fact we have tens of thousands of people here that have no place to go. So it was actually the Israelis that went to the American Jewish organizations and said, get them out. And getting them out meant transferring everyone to Rome. They were settled in Ladispoli and suburbs, and then you go to the American Embassy, helped by HIAS. They told you how to fill out the application, emphasize persecution, and other things like that. And they went by Rome with a sealed train. All this was paid for by the United States government. Once you got the visa to the United States, there was a whole resettlement apparatus run by the federations and an organization called NYANA, which is a Jewish group for settling new Americans in New York. And again, anyone that was bringing in these Russians, they were reimbursed by the United States government, both Jewish organizations and some non-Jewish organizations as well. Now, what developed was freedom of choice. debate, what happened? When people, in March of '76, most Soviet Jews dropped out. They wanted to go to America. Rabin was incensed. And Rabin said basically, you're stealing the future. He said to the American Jewish community, you're stealing our future. You're taking these people, we need them. So what developed was something called the freedom of choice debate. The mainstream Israeli position was the following. They protested that we need these well-educated Jews. Look at what happened in the 1950s. We took uneducated people. We've been waiting for this aliyah, this immigration, and we're losing it. It's the end of Israel as far as they were concerned. It makes life much more difficult. They also argued the Soviet Union only lets out a limited number of people. If the dropouts take those places, then those people who want to come to Israel aren't going to be able to leave. They were afraid, or they argued, if everyone goes to the United States, the Soviet Union will realize it's a facade or something that's going to one's homeland. They'll probably close the gates. And basically, Rabin and the other Israelis were saying, we can't compete with American Jews. We can't compete with America, especially if they get aid from American Jews who are providing housing, jobs, and even scholarships to local Jewish day schools.
Didn't it start earlier with Golda?
No.
Who went to talk to Kreisky to tell him to close the Vienna camp?
Okay, but but okay, to the best of my knowledge, I'm having trouble thinking on the Kreisky, that was after the terrorist incident with Kreisky and Golda. And the compromise was, that what they agreed was, and the Israelis gave in, that the Austrians collect the passports. The Austrians are in charge, no longer the Israelis. But what happens here is, it's only in March of '76, when it goes over 50% of dropouts, that's when, it was March of '76, in June of '76, all the Jewish leaders come in for the Jewish Agency Board of Governors. Rabin called them into a meeting at Binyanei HaUmah, on the convention center there, and he said, this is the end of the state of Israel, you're stealing our people, you have to stop. And that's when it took place. So now, but the American position was, the other side, they were saying, look, we have a liberal tradition in America, American Jews, we help people that are in need, these are our brothers and sisters. There's a Jewish tradition of Pidyon Shvuim, freeing the prisoners. There was also a sense of Holocaust guilt. We didn't act now, we should act now and do something. The idea was, if they can only go to Israel and people decide not to leave because of that, no one knows if that would have been the case, then what if they stay in the Soviet Union and something should happen in the future? It will be on our conscience. Then there was this idea about forcing others to go. This is a minor point, but these groups of American Jews would go to Ladispoli in Rome to try to encourage Soviet Jews to go on to Israel and not to come to America. So one person told me the story. He said, so this old man looks at me and says, Undu, and you live in America, and you want me to go to Israel? I want to go, you're being a hypocrite. Now, the most extreme position, one of the interesting positions, is someone called Jim Rice, who was the head of the Federation in Chicago. He used to work for Hayes in North Africa. He smuggled a lot of Moroccan Jews to Israel for the Israeli government when he worked for Hayes in the 1950s. His point was, we have the same right as the Israelis. The Israelis claim, they're waiting for these people, they need these people, we need them. The gates of America closed in 1924. The Jewish community has never been replenished. This is our future. And we should get the maximum number of people. And so Chicago took a lot of, they pushed for the maximum amount of Soviet Jews, as did Lexington, Kentucky, and a few other places. So what happens? They set up a committee of 8. They take 4 Israelis and 4 bureaucrats from American Jewish organizations. They go to Geneva, Switzerland, and they try to work out a compromise, a deal. And basically what they decided was they were going to have a temporary freeze on aiding Soviet Jews that didn't want to go to Israel. And the idea was, let's try it for 6 months and see what happens. Will people still come out or not come out, etc. So basically, the organizations, Hayes and JDC, agreed. But then, by now, this is American Jewish politics, who's providing and controlling most of the funding? the Council of Jewish Federations. So against the wishes of the Israelis, the issue came up at the General Assembly in Philadelphia. They discussed the Committee of Eight agreement. And in the hall, Leonard Fain got up. In those days he was a reporter, wrote for the Jewish press, a former professor, and he said, "Where am I? This is the United States of America. What are the Israelis telling us to do? They're basically telling us to go to our government, close the gates. We, the American Jewish community, are going to say to the Soviet Jews, you can't come to America after the Holocaust?" So Fisher understood he didn't have the votes, they never voted on it, and all the aid continued. No one ceased anything. Okay, and Auerbach, writing at the time, he says, this decision, he said, was an American Jewish Declaration of Independence from Israel. What's interesting, and then we're going to move on, because we have to finish up, by the late 70s, several American Jewish federations don't want any more Soviet Jews. Too many. Not Chicago, but other places saying, we're overwhelmed, there are too many coming in, we don't have the money, we don't have the resources, we don't have the patience. Let them go to Israel, or they worked out an agreement where if you didn't take your fair share, you put money into a fund to help other federations that were willing to take more Jews. So by the late 70s, there were a lot of second thoughts in America vis-a-vis the Soviet Jewry issue. Okay, now, the final part, and then we'll finish, has to do with Gorbachev coming to power in '85. He probably did not want to open the gates. What he was most concerned about was a brain drain. And he said it'll be a disaster for the Soviet Union, etc. I don't think he took a course on Jewish history that might have looked at the golden age of Spain and the effect of the expulsion of the Jews on Spain, but he was concerned about it. But basically he wanted détente, and what happened was the change with the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, basically deciding to make an issue out of the Soviet Jewry point about letting them leave, either giving them rights, but also, in addition to giving them rights, letting those that want to leave the country to leave, to go to wherever they want to go. So basically, he put it on the agenda. Beginning in once Gorbachev comes into power, there's a series of summits, 3 or 4 summits. One is in Reykjavik, one is in Washington, one's in Moscow. There might have been a 4th in Geneva, I'm not really sure, I don't recall. But whenever, at those summits, the President of the United States, Schultz, the Secretary of State, they put on the agenda the issue of Soviet Jewish immigration. And then it became clear to Gorbachev that that's the price. You want détente, you're going to have to let the Jews go, but they also liberalized the Soviet Union in terms of the way Jews were treated, religious freedom, and other things. Now, so by '87, it's clear the gates are going to open, and about 90% plus, the figure isn't really 100% accurate, most people don't want to go to Israel. They want to go some other place, preferably the Golden Medina, the United States. And I said, why? Most see the United States as paradise. I mean, if you're interested in improving opportunities for your children, economic opportunities, educational opportunities, then the United States has a lot to offer. The United States policy shifted. All of a sudden, as soon as it's clear the gates are going to open, they stopped processing visas. There was a way, it was very hard to get a visa in Moscow, but you could get a third country visa. You could go to another country from Moscow on an American visa and then get a refugee visa to the United States. It was a way of doing things, but they stopped processing visas in about May of '88. We don't have any money left. There's no budget. So that was a sign to people, you can't get visas anymore at the American Embassy. In August of '88, Meese, the Attorney General, sent a note to Powell, who was in the White House, saying, you have to enforce the law. There was a 1980 Refugee Act which said the only person that can get a refugee visa has to be someone that's proven a well-founded fear of persecution. Up until that time, no Jewish person had to prove a well-founded fear of persecution. Because they were Jewish, they automatically got the refugee visa. So that was a sign of change. And in Rome, Rome was the place where they got refugee visas. The dropouts, rejection was running about 16 to 20%. So it's a sign again, something is happening, something is changing. Okay, now, to finish up, what did the American Jewish community do? They organized, some people were saying, once they heard the figure 16 to 20%, I don't know if anyone here is familiar with Arthur Morse's While 6 Million Died. But his book talked about Germany in the 1930s, Breckinridge Long and Company from the State Department, where the consuls were being anti-Semitic. So some Jewish organizations started talking about those terms. The consuls are anti-Semitic again. They're not allowing Jews to get visas. Okay? Now, so what did they do? They got together behind Frank Lautenberg in his first time in the Senate, when he back in the 80s, and he introduced the Lautenberg Amendment in November of 1989. What was the Lautenberg Amendment? The Lautenberg Amendment said, anyone in the Soviet Union who happens to be Jewish, or else an evangelical Christian Ukrainian, there were like two evangelical Ukrainian groups, these three categories, the Jews, the two evangelical groups, because of the history of the Soviet Union, they're automatically eligible for refugee visas to the United States. In other words, this thing doesn't hold. They went around the law. They altered it. Now, that would indicate that the American Jewish community is going to fight on the issue of getting Soviet Jews into the United States. Because they're saying no one is exempt. They're automatically eligible, provided, of course, there's a visa. You can't reject them. Okay, now, but I think it was a screen for the real intention. They were playing a political game, a public relations game. Go ahead. Now, what happened? Every year, as part of the law in the United States, there were negotiations between Congress and the President over refugee slots for the coming fiscal year. They determined how many slots. In those days, there were about 80,000, 100,000, and every refugee slot was funded, which meant transportation to the United States the first month of resettlement. So as part of this negotiation, in 88 going into 89, they invited in Max Fisher. Now Max Fisher was like the eldest statesman in the American Jewish community, a very wealthy person from Detroit, headed every major American mainstream organization at one time. And he had a committee, what he called the no-name committee. Mark Talisman was one of the key Jewish lobbyists in Washington. When I say Jewish, working for major American Jewish organizations, very successful guy. Shoshana Cardin was a woman who was head of major American Jewish organizations. Mendel Berman came out of the federations in Detroit. And they met with these people from Congress and the government on refugee slots for Soviet Jews. Clearly, the Israeli government was consulted and the Soviet Union was consulted because of what happened. Now, and Fisher had the support of all the American Jewish organizations, and as I said, they're consulted. Okay, now what happened? What did they decide? They decided for fiscal year 1989, beginning in November 89, I believe, there'd be 50,000 slots, refugee slots, for people from the Soviet Union. Out of these, 40,000 would be for Jews, and out of the 40,000, 32,000 would be funded. Now there's a stipulation, you had to have first-degree relatives in the United States, or else you couldn't come in as a refugee. Now, but the other thing was, they introduced, this is why the Soviet Union was involved, a dual-track system. What does a dual-track system mean? If you wanted to go to the United States and you were in the Soviet Union, you had to go to the American embassy in Moscow and get a visa. If you were in the Soviet Union after a particular date and you left, you couldn't get a visa, a refugee visa, at any American embassy in Europe. So therefore they did away with the dropouts. You had to do it in Moscow before you left, not afterwards. You couldn't, in other words, leave an Israeli visa and then drop out. So that was the dual track, and then what they did was, immediately, the first year quota, they took everyone in the pipeline that was in Vienna and Rome during the first year and a half, and they brought them into the United States. And then there were no more dropouts after that. That's one of the reasons why the Israeli government of Shamir actually liked this program. Pamela Cohen, who came from this union of councils, these were the grassroots people in the Soviet Jewry movement that were much more radical and even more active at times than the mainstream people, she called it a selection plan. And selection plan thinking of the Holocaust in the sense, who shall live and who shall die, because she was of the opinion people won't leave the Soviet Union because they don't want to go to Israel and they can't get into the United States. Within a month, there were no visas left for the first 2 years. So, and now, what was the consequence of that? About 400,000 people in the Soviet Union decided to go to Israel within 2 years, over a period of 3 years. There's a quote which you can look at. It's not really that important. Steve Nassiter talking about the American Jewish community agreeing to a quota, something they said they'd never do. But that's, okay, let's just go on. Now, one final thing about direct flights, because some of this was a controversy in Israel over the last month or two with Amnon Mantver. Over this whole question, someone that used to work for the the Liaison Bureau claimed that they forced Soviet Jews to go to Israel. And then there was an argument whether that was true or not. But one thing that was interesting, there was always this issue of direct flights. Once the gates open up, the gates are opening up and hundreds of thousands of people literally are going to leave. So how are they going to get to Israel? Quote, what are direct flights? With direct flights, it means you fly either by Bucharest, Budapest, or Warsaw. Now, the fourth site was Helsinki, but the Israelis closed it down. Now, you still had communist regimes in Bucharest, Budapest, and Warsaw. And it was made clear to the Israeli government, no one is dropping out. Now, whether people would have dropped out or not, no one knows, but they didn't have the option. With Helsinki, the Finns said, anyone that lands in our airport will be read a declaration and they can decide where they want to go. So the Israelis closed it down. Now what's interesting, because this is the 1989 already, every major Jewish organization, including these grassroots people, all endorsed direct flights. Let them go to Israel. Okay. Now, why did American Jewish leaders support a quota? We're just about finished now. It was clear to them that the United States government policy, the Cold War is over. I didn't mention the Cold War enough today. The Cold War is over. The American government is no longer giving preference to Soviet Jews. And if we want to bring in Soviet Jews, we're going to have to fight the government. We don't want to fight the government. The second was other groups wanted the slots. Anyone that studied refugee policy and immigration policy in the United States would know they're often coalitions. And with the major Reform Act of 1965, which opened up the gates of America, major Jewish groups were involved, but they didn't do it alone. There were a lot of Catholic groups and Protestant groups and other national groups were involved. A lot of these groups resented the preference given to Soviet Jews. And these Jewish groups were aware of it, and they figured it's no longer a Cold War. They can go to Israel, they can even stay in the Soviet Union and not be persecuted, so they dropped the issue. And they were clear that you see this, a lot of the leaders were aware many of these Soviet Jews are not really refugees, and they didn't want that issue to become a public issue and debated. And the federations, too expensive to resettle them in the United States. We don't have the resources, we can't afford it, we'll all go bankrupt, let them go to Israel. And they found it was easier to raise money to resettle in Israel than to resettle in the United States, which is interesting. And then the idea was, look, what's the worst case scenario? They're going to Israel. You know, it's not the 1930s. There's a state, and it's, you know, it's fine. Okay, so now my conclusion is that they acted out of the American Jewish leaders basically acted out of their own self-interest. If you look over those concluding points there, it's not because, I mean, I argue, and I could be wrong on this, it's not that they want to serve Israel. They could have served, you know, in 1970 when they met with Rabin said, serve Israel, don't aid them. And they said, no, we want them to go to Israel, but we're going to help them if they want to come to America. People are free to choose. In the 1990s, they had a different tune. They acted basically, this is their own self-interest. They didn't want to fight their government. They didn't want to fight these other organizations. It wasn't that they primarily wanted to serve the interests of Israel. That was a secondary matter. And so in the past, they rejected Israeli pressure on Soviet Jews. They supported Israel because it coincided with their own interests. And in contrast, well, to the 1930s, I didn't deal with this final point. Do I still have one more slide? So in a way, to some extent, I guess what I'd like to say, this is I didn't really deal with these final 2 points about J.J. Goldberg's book about Jews in American politics. We suggest by the time you get to the 90s, American Jews are no longer a minority, but part of the majority in a psychological sense. But he might have gone a little bit overboard. But again, coming back to, okay, next slide then, that should be, Jewish power in America. It's clear that the Jewish establishment organizations were very powerful in the 70s and 80s, but they exercised restraint. One thing which explains a lot of Jewish influence here, which one should keep in mind, is there was a Cold War going on. So when you want to give preference to Russian Jews who want to come in as refugees, they're fleeing from hell. They're fleeing from the Soviet Union. The enemy, the arch enemy of the United States. So you don't have to do too much pressuring on the Hill when a lot of these congressmen, especially congressmen that don't have any Jewish voters whatsoever, they're all gung-ho anti-communists. I mean, how do you set up a congressional wives for Soviet Jewry where 95% or 98% of the congressional wives are not Jewish women, and they're all involved in this organization? And they have a Seder at Passover time outside on the Hill. They video it and everything, and it's broadcast over Voice of America to everyone in the Soviet Union. It's the Cold War. And once the Cold War is over, they're much less active, they're much less pushing, very, very, very cautious. And this whole thing about the importance of the Holocaust, there's once a very influential book by Peter Novick, but most people don't read Peter Novick anymore. I was talking about how important the Holocaust is. So one of the lessons of the Holocaust are quotas and everything else, but yet by 1989, the American Jewish community puts a quota on Soviet Jews, and they don't blink. Okay, so I think I'll open up to questions and comments.
How many Jews came to the United States until the change of...
In my book, I have the figures. Probably, until when?
Until the change of the policy.
Oh, until the change of the policy, probably about 150,000. But today they're probably over 400,000 or 500,000 Jews from the former Soviet Union in the United States. Now, what's interesting is that the quota after the first 2 or 3 years, the quota was never filled. There were fewer people that came in than that could have come in. But then other people found other ways of immigrating and coming into the United States. And in the year 2000, the country of first choice for Jews from the former Soviet Union was not Israel, not the United States, but Germany. And Germany has about 220,000, probably the number is still growing, Jews from the former Soviet Union. Yep.
Did the Jews in the Soviet Union have any influence? You did emphasize the role of Israel, the role of the United States. How about the Jews themselves in Russia on this kind of,
Oh, okay. Well, first of all, there's a new book out about When They Come For Us, We Won't Be There, by Gal Beckerman, which talks all about the struggle for Soviet Jewry through the eyes of those people that fought the struggle within the Soviet Union. Although, without a doubt, everything that's happening overseas has a lot to do with what they were allowed to do or not do, etc. But one thing about the Soviet Jewish community, outside of political action, it's a very successful community economically in every way. They're probably, it's not my field of scholarship, but it's amazing when you study, when I did all the research, you assume these people are persecuted. After all, they all want to leave and everything else like that, but they were very, very successful. In fact, universities in the Soviet Union opened up before Soviet Jews, long before American universities opened up to American Jews. The American Jews in universities, with the exception of City University, places like that, it's a post-World War II phenomenon. In the 20s, Jews went from the shtetl to the cities to the universities. So they became the best educated group in the Soviet Union, and there were all these areas. That's what he was concerned about, especially in military technology, optics, medicine, a lot of Jews. Now, what changed there was, and this explains why would people want to leave, was the nationality policy within the Soviet Union in the 1970s of giving preferential for local populations when it comes to higher education, and that was at the expense of Jews, Ukrainians, and Russians that were often in the other republics. That their children, so people came to the conclusion, our children aren't going to have what we have, so let's leave.
Well, let me say something about
Yeah.
that. So, I rarely actually speak up.
No, that's fine.
I am a product of Soviet Jewry. In fact, my family was an activist in the movement to get out of the Soviet Union. I remember 70s very, very well. It was a very, very stressful time. Situation was difficult. A lot of people compared our situation, which was starting to happen in Nazi Germany in the 30s, and there were worries among a number of people that eventually, it's a closed society, they can do to us whatever they want to. And if you have a chance to get out, you get out now. And I think that's how I grew up. I agree with you, it's the issue of anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union is a very difficult one. It's it's multi-edged. And there is not a single answer to it. But people did as well as they could. However, there was always that feeling that somebody is going to come after you. And especially after the 1950s, when a lot of Jewish families were waiting with suitcases, packed suitcases, because they thought that there would be a national deportation of Jews to the east, which what happened to other national groups in Russia, like Tatars, and that was really, really unpleasant. So, just my...
Okay, no, very good. No, the one thing I would just say about that is, there's this issue, but I've never seen it done in scholarship in terms of, there were rumors and there were all these, but I've never seen it written down, in black and white, this whole thing about the potential for a relocation, a massive relocation to Siberia in the 1950s. The only thing I slightly disagree with, one has to be aware of is that up until the 1970s, for most Soviet Jews, life was good. In a relative term. There was no Jewish culture, without a doubt, but, okay. They had the opportunities, they had the economic standing, they were a part of the intelligentsia, they knew what they could do, what they couldn't do, etc. But then the policy changed. Okay.
It's the two different perceptions. You describe it from the outside, and she describes the perceptions of the Jews inside, and it doesn't contradict each other.
No, but let me give you I want to give you an example of something. And this I just picked up in a recent interview, but it's only one interview. I was telling you before, the way one of the ways the Liaison Bureau in Israel dealt with the American Jewish Committee in New York, they went to Paris. And the American Jewish Committee had a guy in Paris, and they got along very well. So this guy, Tzvi Nesta, comes in, and what is he complaining about? He's complaining in the late 60s or early 70s, they're not going to leave. Life is too good in the Soviet Union. We're not going to get the people from the heartland. That's what that was their perception. They're not going to leave, it's too good. They're like the Americans. But then the Soviet Union changed this policy. That's my only point. But that's only one opinion.
I'm trying to get answers to two questions. But just in passing, I'd like to say that I think that your perception of the Jewish lobby having declined in power over the last couple of decades is a minority view. I don't know anybody that thinks that. But my two questions. First question, why is Jackson Vanik still in effect? Who benefits from that? And the second question is, Russia, not the Soviet Union, stripped roughly 25 million Russians of Russian citizenship, and at the same time introduced a visa-less arrangement with Israel. That took a lot of political muscle. Do you have any details on that?
Oh, no, I don't. I mean, that's my escape, but no, I don't keep up with it. I really haven't kept up with it. Now, why the Jackson, see, that's the point. I thought it was. I said to you, I thought the Jackson-Vanik Amendment was still there. You know, and I don't think it's ever been repealed. I don't know if it has to be renewed or whatever.
Somebody benefits from that.
Yeah, okay, that I don't know. I haven't followed that. And in terms of Soviet policy,
Not
from,
Soviet Russia. This is,
I'm sorry?
if I talk about the citizenship thing, that was not the Soviet government.
Okay, now, no, but in terms of the visa to Israel, that was a recent development.
Right.
So I gather it works both ways. I mean, Israel was interested in it probably because of tourism, and probably because of tourism, its own economic interests, having better relationships, etc. And I think that Israel is probably not interested about other nationality policies and citizenship policies in the Soviet Union that don't affect it directly.
I can see that, but how did they manage? That was their interest. Where did the political muscle come from to pull it off?
Oh, that I don't know. I don't have a clue. I don't. That's interesting. I mean, you're assuming it was a very difficult thing to pull off.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we have some politicians in our country who believe that they have a very good rapport with people in the former Soviet Union, people in Russia, people in the Ukraine, etc., including our foreign minister. And maybe he has muscle there. I'm being a little facetious, but I just don't.
Or else the Russians thought that with more than a million Russians in Israel, it's worthwhile for them to make it easier for Israeli Russians to go and visit Russia.
No, it's true. But is the Jewish lobby in Russia so strong now that it was able to pull this off?
Well, I don't know if it has to be. No, see, that's not the point. I don't know if it has to be necessarily. But I don't know the Soviet Union. I don't know Russia the way you might know Russia. I don't think it necessarily has to be a Jewish lobby within Russia. It could just be, if you're Russian Minister of Economics, you have X number of people that are very successful financially, economically, with investments, high tech. They're going back and forth between Israel and the Soviet Union. So why not make the whole thing easier? Why not facilitate?
Well, also there is a resurgence of Russian Christianity, and there's so many tours of Russian Christians or Ukrainians who are going to Jerusalem and for religious purposes that have nothing to do with Judaism.
Yes.
Were there reasons beyond Soviet desire for détente in the 70s why they let the Jews out? Because it was such a reversal of Soviet policy. For decades, they hadn't allowed anyone out except in very small numbers. Were there other internal or external reasons?
Okay, well, again, I can't answer. My field is not Soviet studies, so I read. One thing which one should keep in mind, that to some extent, much of what was happening with the Jews and letting Jews out was also happening with the German minority, which is probably as large and if not larger than the Jewish minority. So, what the Russians the Soviet Union was very concerned about were relations with Germany, financial support from Germany, and they realized if they were positive on the German issue and letting Germans be resettled, etc., and Germany was pleased with that, they benefited. Now, the other thing is, in my own opinion, and this is where I disagree with this book by Beckerman about the Soviet Jewry movement within the Soviet Union, about how influential it was. It seems to me that what the Soviet Union was most concerned about was probably the Helsinki agreements. And having this agreement whereby the post-World War II borders are going to be recognized by everyone. So what they wanted to score points with the West. And one way of scoring points with the West was on human rights issues. So you let some Jews out, you let some Germans out, you let some of the Greeks out, and various other groups in small numbers.
And this ended after the invasion of Afghanistan.
Afghanistan, the whole Soviet Union closed down for the Jews and also for the Germans in '82. By then, everything was sealed. And this whole Soviet Jewry movement, which is interesting, almost broke up in the United States. People were very depressed because nothing works like success. So when you had all these protests against the Soviet Union, and all of a sudden in the '70s they opened up the gates, people were coming out. You realize the protests, are fruitful. They matter. All of a sudden, in '82, everything sort of stopped, and no one was getting out. People were very frustrated, both inside and outside. Those were the years really were hard. I mean, one other thing I would just say, because you whet my appetite here about this. When you think of the whole thing, one really wonders, but this would take much more knowledge of the Soviet Union, why did they have Jewish identity on their ID cards? Americans don't understand, but in a lot of countries, like in Israel, we have an ID card. So they listed being Jewish as a nationality. Now, if they didn't do that, so people would have just registered as Russian or Ukrainian, and millions of people might have disappeared. But they didn't. Someone made a decision in the 1930s, and that kept a lot of things alive.
And difficult.
Excuse me?
And very difficult.
Very
For those
okay,
who
very
get that,
difficult. Okay, without a doubt.
Theoretically, your argument that you take this case study to show that the power of the Jewish lobby is not as strong as some other people think is questionable. You took one case in which there was a conflict of interest between Israel and the American Jewry. How can you draw a general conclusion about the growing or the diminishing power of the Jewish lobby?
Okay, when I talk about a Jewish lobby, I'm not talking about the Israel lobby, the Jewish lobby. I'm saying if you take a look at Jewish organizations that are involved in issues affecting what they consider to be the Jewish public or the Jewish interest. So here you have a case study of what was probably one of the most important matters that affected them. And we take a look at what happened. We realize they pushed for it. They fought for it. They were very diligent all the way along until the situation changed. And when that situation changed with circumstances, they acted accordingly. So it turns out that they're powerful, they're influential, they have wealth, they have connections, they're willing, in contrast, especially in the 1930s, I didn't do the historical analysis, where they used to be frightened of their own shadow, they were willing to go public. For example, they confronted the President of the United States. So they do all these things, but they do all these things within the context of a Cold War. Once the Cold War is over, they retreat. They back down. They become much less aggressive, very cautious. Yeah, but now whether it's typical, I don't, have to do more case studies.
I want to go back to your question about why the Soviets had them put Jewish on their thing. I don't know time-wise, maybe one of you do. When did Hitler and the Russians sign the pact that we're going to be allies?
That was 7 years after, 7 or 8 years after.
I wondered if that was
No.
no. Time isn't right. Okay.
It was, so in 32, you're saying 7 years after they started the classification on...
No, I'm sorry. No, they signed the pact 7 years after.
So that was 39.
Right.
So in 32?
I assume that they did the ID thing in 31 or 32. I'm willing to stand corrected, I just have to check it. I mean, one of the ironies, but again, we're going to run it, I'm not pro-Soviet, but one of the ironies is that because of that agreement between Ribbentrop and, hundreds of thousands of Jews were saved. When the Soviet Union retreated, they deported a lot of people to Siberia, but that saved those people. They were around after the war.
This is a speculation, but perhaps they started identifying Jews then. That's when Stalin was moving against the old Bolsheviks. A huge percentage of whom were Jewish.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, up back.
Yeah, I'm sorry,
Sure.
it will be a little bit to divert the conversation.
Okay.
Tutsi from Central Africa and Congo, Zaire, in the eastern part of Congo.
Okay.
And we have a lot of issues about discrimination with the government. And the government of Congo doesn't accept us as well as the government of Rwanda, which is led by Tutsi. And we are left in between. So I was trying to see what would be your analogy on how we can make the U.S. government being like to have an impact in what is going on. Is it that we should have a strong lobby here in USA? Is it that the USA has to have some interest, as you were alluding to the Cold War? Or I came in a little bit late, but I wanted to have for the public in here, how can we make the U.S. government being involved in what is going in Eastern Congo for my Tutsi people who are being discriminated against simply because of being Tutsi, and they cannot they can't get help from the Congolese government, which is protecting them, and they cannot be helped by the Rwandan government, though it's a Tutsi government, but it's a different country. So here is the USA, and we are here. What should we do?
Okay, well, further, I think that my suggestion would be the following. There'd be a couple things. One would be to find a group in the United States that identifies with your cause. Like, for example, from an Israeli point of view, they found American Jews. But the American Jews weren't the only ones. Like, for example, they found a whole group of nuns and priests. There's an organization called the National Interreligious Task Force for Soviet Jewry. Because of Vatican and certain things happening there were liberal Catholics that all of a sudden got turned on to the issue of Soviet Jewry. So you have to find in the United States or groups of people, whether it be African Americans or some Jewish group, like, for example, in Darfur, with pressure being on Congress in Darfur, there's a reform movement in the United States. They seem to, amongst the Jews, they seem to adopt Darfur. So when I go around Washington and I go up to Rochester, New York, I go by a synagogue, and all of a sudden I see a big sign about Darfur, Save Darfur, and things like that. I think that so if you have an organization or you have a group that's going to push the issue and try to lobby in Congress and influence public opinion, then you need a tremendous PR. I mean, I think it helps when you get, someone all of a sudden that writes regularly for the New York Times or Washington Post picks up the issue and writes, like Christoph, for example, writes about Africa a lot and things like that. That also helps. But the one thing that helped, in my opinion, when I think about it afterwards, the one thing that led to tremendous success of the efforts on behalf of Soviet Jewry was something called the Cold War. That issue that was crucial for the United States. I mean, we're after the Cold War period, it's 20 years. But before then, in America, I mean, that was sort of the context. Ever since the article by X in Foreign Affairs in the 1940s, America was in a Cold War. And the arch enemy of the United States is the Soviet Union. And who's persecuting the Jews? The Soviet Union. That helped the case.
Get yourself persecuted by Islamists. Then the U.S. will help you.
No.
Any other question? All right, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very